That was literally what I was going to say. Lala is my partner in crime. So I'm going to be talking to you guys today about our second year Intro Bio course. So we don't teach Intro Bio here at UCSB until students have gone through their first year. So that presents some interesting problems. Before we get to that, I want to acknowledge that this effort is part of an HHMI grant that we got in 2014. And this is a team-based effort here. This is as close as I'll get to owning a Porsche, but that will be my future ride. You'll see me waving as I leave. But this is a team effort made up of multiple lecturers, postdocs, as well as faculty members. Before we got the grant in 2014, institutional research had shown that there was a great disparity in terms of student retention. So there's about 1,000 or 1,100 students that come in as pre-biology. That's our first-year biology students. What you see in this graph here is that there's about 650 or so that are continuing generation. So their parents have gone to university, for example. Whereas with the teal bars, we have our Educational Opportunities Program, which you heard about a bit earlier. And this is a group of students that are identified based on socioeconomic status. It's not completely overlapping with underrepresented minorities, but it's kind of a similar demographic. So what you'll notice is within the first 2 years, we lose a lot of students. And it's primarily with the EOP and the URM students. So there's some sort of magical threshold where in the third year to the fourth year, our retention rates go up quite dramatically. When we first got here, we decided to look at student grades. So we have a retention observation, and then we looked at their cumulative science GPA. And doing a logistic regression, we saw that cumulative science GPA is a really strong predictor of whether or not a student's going to be retained in the biology major. And since it's really important to look at that specific point in time, that sophomore grade at the end of their second year, you can clearly see that students who are continuing generation, again shown with this lime green box plot, they're doing considerably well, relatively speaking, to the EOP students. And these are EOP students that intersect with URM, so they're both. They're a double, for example. Okay, so we have a combination both of retention disparities as well as grade achievement disparities. Before the grant was awarded in 2014, students didn't have any biology in their freshman year. So in this chart, what you're going to see is in the black, where we have anything in the first year. Okay, there's no structure for these incoming pre-biology students. However, the HHMI grant, as written, had the creation of these freshman seminars, these biome courses that Lala is going to be talking about this afternoon, as well as the expansion of this course-based undergraduate research experience called Rumble, which Lala will also be talking about. So he'll be looking at the first year experience. Traditionally, before the grant, bio students saw biology in their second year in a large lecture theater. So MCDB1A is Intro Bio 1, MCDB1B is Intro Bio 2, taught in the fall and the winter quarters respectively, and they're large enrollment, as you can see, typically over 1,000 students. The grant had created a co-curricular mentoring program, which Rolf is going to talk about in about 40 minutes. And then it also had the establishment of a parallel alternative section that we kind of got carte blanche to deal with in terms of structure. Okay, we're going to carve off about 300 of the students out of the incoming 1,000 in their second year of study. The idea here was to have a promotion of student equity where we could promote both the development of self-regulated learning students, right? So the capacity to learn how to learn, as well as to master the course content of Intro Bio. And the second was also to create a sense of belonging. It's really important to me as a scientist to feel like I belong to that community, and I want to give that experience to the students as well. And the way that we were going to do this was by using evidence-based approaches, building those structures into our courses, assessing their effectiveness. Are they actually promoting student equity? We're going to look at the analysis, and we're going to communicate it through publishing, conference presentations, poster presentations, things like that. And then we're going to innovate on those and create new interventions. This is familiar to everyone in this room, right? This is kind of a modification of the scientific process. So here what I'm showing you are a few papers that were really instrumental to kind of the design and the building of this sophomore course, which is what I'm going to be focusing on. So the idea, again, was to use this course as a vehicle to help the students learn how to learn, as well as master biological concepts, but also to create a sense of belonging, a sense of community. Since we had outlined in the grant the establishment of 2 parallel courses of the Intro Bio series, it allows for a really unique kind of experimental approach. Okay, so that's what I'm trying to show you with these arrows. As the quarter proceeds, in the traditional section, you have some clicker questions in the class, as well as summative online quizzes at the end of each week. In the alternative section, we design a whole bunch of different interventions. And I'm going to highlight a few of those in today's talk. But for example, we've seen evidence with flipped classes earlier today. Targeted readings are similar to that, in which you have the students complete a reading assignment that you create that guides them to use the textbook and look at content in that textbook, then use that time that you bought yourself in class to have active learning, for example. A study boot camp that we used similarly, as Norbert was talking about earlier, where you identify students who struggled on the first midterm, and then in one session you kind of talk about metacognitive approaches to studying. Ecoach, Tim McKay is here, the pioneer of Ecoach. This is something that was born out of this study boot camp, which is an online mentorship/coaching program that we've integrated into a course to help the students learn how to learn, as well as multiple right-to-learn assignments. Again, the idea here is that we have shared learning objectives and outcomes across these two courses. We want the students to leave with the same content. But what we're going to do is we're going to interrogate to see whether or not the interventions that we've built into these courses are actually promoting the goal here in terms of promoting equity. The structure themselves is relatively similar. We have 4 lectures a week in the traditional section. In the alternative section, you have 3 lectures, and you replace that 4 lecture with the tutorial, a small group interactive tutorial. Again, the idea here is to buy yourself time in this alternative section to have multiple active learning strategies and approaches used in the lecture itself. So if you haven't seen this type of analysis before, this is DART. This is from Kimberly Tano's group up in the Bay. Essentially, you can use sound to record and see what you're actually doing in your lecture. It records sound waves. And then it interprets that as, for example, with this single area, this is just me prattling on just like I am right now. And then if I had you discussing a clicker question, you'd have multiple. It's a way of quantifying what you're doing in the class. And the idea here is that you can promote more active engagement and confrontation with tricky subject material in the class in a formative manner, rather than kind of just lecturing to the students. This kind of approach in getting the students engaged in the lecture is something that we were really interested in looking at, because we wanted to ensure that the students were still coming to class and finding use out of coming to the class. So what we did is we looked at clicker attendance throughout the quarter of this first fall quarter of Intro Bio. And what you'll see in the teal, the darker color again, this is the traditional section with relatively lower participation in class, whereas with the alternative section where we've built in all these active learning exercises in the lecture itself, you maintain really high attendance. And this is for 2.5%, right? So it's like a whiff of credit. It's very, very little. And in the traditional section, you actually get some credit as well. So that's kind of a commonality. Something that would kind of highlight here that this active approach is really important in engaging and maintaining the students' participation in the class. In the class itself, I clicker questions, interpretation of data. For example, interpret this Western blot that I taught you about. Think, pair, share. What does this immunofluorescence show you? It's interpretation of data. So we have our lecture where we're actively engaging with the students. We also have tutorial sections, which I was mentioning. So last night, Dean Wiltzius was talking about how HHMI funds, as well as funds from UCSB, went to revamping a classroom and converting it into an active learning classroom. This is the classroom. So you have kind of floor-to-ceiling whiteboards. Every table with 6 to 7 students at it facing each other has a computer. There I am 3 years ago, looking much younger. So the idea here is to have the students kind of interacting with each other, but also in a more intimate session with either undergraduate learning assistants, UGLAs, we have 2 of them per section, or 1 graduate TA as well. Sometimes we're in that room as well as with the students. But again, the idea here is that we want to use these active learning classrooms to confront tricky subject material. So what Lalo and I did when we first got here is we went through historical exam performance and we identified the really troublesome concepts. Things like, what's the difference between a homologous chromosome and a sister chromatid? Where would you find various alleles? Things that we knew students historically at UCSB had struggled with. We designed tutorials that allowed the students to collaboratively solve these types of problems. So since we have these 2 parallel tracks of the traditional lecture and then the alternative structure lecture, one thing we want to do, and given that we had conserved learning outcomes, was look at the assessment of common exam questions. So over 50% of our exam questions were shared. What you'll notice is that we have a set of control questions. These are questions where there was no active learning engagement with the subject material. It was delivered traditionally through the lecture in the 2 sections. So you're going to see there's no difference in terms of student achievement on those courses. Whereas those where we did have alternative structures in terms of active learning techniques in the classroom itself, you'll see that there's a significant increase in terms of student grade. The improvement's about 10% here in terms of those questions. How does this translate into student grade? I'm going to delve in on the URM students. It's a particular focus of HHMI. And what you'll notice again is with the teal, with the traditional section, the intro bio grade, this is for the fall quarter course, it's about 2.1. It's barely a pass, right? Whereas with the alternative structure, we've increased the grade by about half a grade point average. This is comparable to the continuing generation students in the traditional lecture section. Okay, so again, trying to strive for the goal of promoting student equity across groups, across student experiences. Another thing that we wanted to do to kind of look at this was, can we predict student performance? Is that another way that we can analyze whether or not students are performing well? So we did a multiple linear regression, identifying multiple significant variables. This was done, and I want to give a shout out to Zach Turner at the Stat Lab here, who has helped me through many R issues that I've had. But together, he and I came up with a predictive model that allowed us to look at student performance, right? So what you see here, again with the URM students, is that we have their predicted grades here on the x-axis, and then their actual earned grades on the y-axis. And in the fall quarter traditional section, you'll see there's this cohort of students that are predicted to actually get around a 2, but they're earning 1. Whereas that group, this cohort boxed here in red, they're absent in the alternative structure. In fact, you see the emergence of groups where their predicted grade is relatively low, but they're actually earning quite high grades. Okay, so this, again, is another piece of evidence that kind of supports the idea that this alternative structure is promoting increased student retention. So we're showing that we have increased course grades. We saw improved examination scores. Are these students actually also retained at a higher rate? That is also observed as they move through the course. I'm not showing you data from Intro Bio 2, which I talked about earlier, but it's a similar kind of trend where those students that are in the alternative structure are retained to a higher rate through the Intro Bio series than those that participate in the traditional section. So we know that the course itself is working. That's great. And I think there's a lot of discipline-based education research that shows that altered course structure does promote student success. Okay? But we wanted to know, where's the success coming from? Is it purely academic, or are we building that sense of community that we were kind of seeking from the very get-go? So we reached out to Brian Sato at UCI. He put us in touch with Peter McPartland, who's a very talented ed grad student at their School of Ed. And they had worked with him previously to look at sense of belonging. So UCI had a validated scale of sense of belonging from Tover and Simon, published in 2010, and we deployed that same survey as a hypothesis here on this campus between, again, the traditional section and the alternative section. And the way that we are capable of doing this is that our lab is common to both of these sections. So we deployed the survey through the lab. So we were able to survey comparable populations of biology students across both of the traditional as well as the alternative section. I'm only showing you one collapsed graph, but this is a 12-point scale with multiple different types of senses of belonging. But what I'm trying to convince you here is that the students in the alternative section do have a significantly greater sense of belonging. And it's largely due to the interaction with the instructors as well as with each other based on the course structure, or at least that's what I would argue. How am I doing for time? 3 minutes? So again, if we go back to the intro bio, kind of the general ideas here, we really want to help the students grow as students as well as feel like they belong to a community. So I'm going to just finish with this boot camp. This is something that's been a pet project that I've been working on for the past 2 years. The ideas from this come from a book that I read during my postdoc in Calgary. If you've not read Making the Most of College, I highly recommend it, especially if you have a kid who's going to go to college. It's something that's amazing. It's a very helpful book. The other thing I was particularly hit by was work by Carol Dweck at Stanford, as well as Duckworth at UPenn. So both growth mindset and grittiness. So what I had done is I identified students who did quite poorly on the first midterm, so less than 60%. I invited 80 of those students to come to the active learning classroom. We went through a one-day kind of boot camp, about 4 hours, where we about readings from this book, as well as kind of takeaways from the research of these two researchers. And I sent them on their merry way. And then when they wrote their second midterm, the class average here is shown in this dark army green camo. Those who didn't show up but were invited did significantly worse. Those, after a 4-hour boot camp, kind of shifting their metacognitive approach, actually did just as well as the class average and significantly better than those that didn't show up. The last thing I'll talk about real quick is something that we've integrated into our course, which is called Ecoach. It's kind of born out of that boot camp where we're talking about metacognition as well as coaching the students to do better. This is integrated to our LMS, so this is Gaucho space, and in the top right you'll see there's this Ecoach button. Essentially the students will fill out a very extensive set of surveys that kind of say, I'm a procrastinator and I'm worried about doing well on my exam and I want to earn an A. And it will send them tailored messages that are automatically generated, well, they're written and then they're sent out automatically. And it's tailored in real time. Okay, so if they didn't do as well in the first midterm and they wanted that A, it will send them feedback about how to change their approaches for the subsequent midterm. So it's kind of a similar type of approach as that boot camp. I'm going to finish with that because I do want to take any questions that people might have.
We have a minute and a half for questions.
Yeah, Satya.
Hi. So as you know, I'm doing the tutorial style discussion section for the physics department, and other faculty have started adopting it this year. So I've been talking to you before about, so the qualitative, there's clear qualitative data that this is a much better, way of doing discussion sections, and it actually improves learning. So we've been talking about quantitative, having quantitative data. So you have these two different groups of students. One is doing the traditional style, and the other one is doing the tutorial style, if you will. So the students self-select themselves which group they go into?
Yes.
Right. So I've had discussions with fellow physicists about how we can get data, and the fact that they self-select already introduces a bias.
Totally.
And so how do you correct for that?
So I think we've done the same analysis as Norbert has, where we've looked at preceding grades as well as subsequent grades, and they're identical. So one thing I'm particularly interested in is, what are the long-term impacts of this? That's a separate question, obviously. But I think as long as you build these tools and you make them accessible, so long as you're helping the people that you can, isn't that serving a purpose, right? I mean, the idea here is if you show evidence and people convert to this method, then yeah, it's gonna work and it's gonna be scaled. But for now, I think we're still at the stage of kind of get people on board. The way I view these things is that if you build a tool and people find use in it, it's serving a purpose, right?
Couple more questions, yes?
So I have a question
Yeah.
about, so you have the students, they are in 2 quarters of the alternative or 2 quarters of the traditional.
And-
Do you have students that swap?
Yes, we do have movers.
And do you have data, so if they start out in the alternative and they go to the traditional, do those students do better than the ones that are traditional?
That is something we're looking into. Yeah, because if I had the time, this is what I want to look at, right? Which is, we know in the quarter things work real well, but what happens when they leave, right? And not just the next quarter, but 2 years. And there's some data that we have that looks fairly promising, not in terms of grade, but retention.
I wonder, a lot of the flipped classroom and the people working in groups, are we also selecting against, introvert versus extrovert in these different personality types and sort of inadvertently? Do you guys think about that?
Yeah, we think about that a lot. I think the thing is, if you chose to take the course, you're exposing yourself, and that's fine, right? And if you're less of a participant, but you're being buoyed up by people who are discussing in front of you, it still serves a purpose in that sense too. I've seen a few students, this is all anecdotal, but there's students who start introverted, and by the end, they're leading the group, right? So I think there is some evolution there as well. Are we done?
Yeah.
Okay, I just want to say thank you to these folks. Okay, so these are our funders, as well as people on campus, as well as off-campus collaborators who have helped with all this research. Thank you, guys.